He thought he had buried the past forever, until one small boy looked at him with familiar eyes. Vincent Castellano had built a reputation for seeing everything. In boardrooms, charity galas, and crowded city streets, people often lowered their voices the moment he appeared because they believed nothing escaped his attention. Yet for 7 years, one person had vanished from his world without leaving behind so much as a goodbye. Grace Carter had once walked the polished halls of his estate with quiet confidence, never asking for recognition, never complaining, never drawing attention to herself. She had simply done her work with a dignity that somehow made everyone around her stand a little straighter. Then one morning she was gone. No demands, no explanations, no forwarding address. Vincent had accepted it as one more chapter closed in a life that rarely paused long enough to wonder why people left. Until now. The rain fell steadily across downtown Chicago, turning sidewalks into mirrors that reflected the gray morning sky. Vincent's driver slowed near a crowded crosswalk as children hurried toward the neighborhood elementary school beneath colorful umbrellas. He barely glanced outside at first, distracted by messages glowing across his phone, until a familiar profile caught his attention. A woman in a faded navy coat held the hand of a young black boy wearing an oversized backpack nearly as large as his shoulders. Her hair was pulled into the same practical bun Vincent remembered from years ago, and although time had etched quiet exhaustion across her face, there was no mistaking Grace Carter. She smiled warmly as she knelt to zip the boy's jacket against the cold, brushing a raindrop from his cheek before straightening his collar with practiced care. The boy laughed softly, wrapped both arms around her waist, and whispered something that made her eyes brighten despite the rain. Vincent watched in complete silence. Grace looked thinner than he remembered, older than she should have after only 7 years. But there was still that unmistakable steadiness in her posture, the same calm dignity she had carried through every room of his estate. As the crossing signal changed, the boy looked back toward the street and waved enthusiastically at an elderly homeless man sitting beneath a bus shelter. "Morning, Mr. Harris," he called with genuine excitement. The old man smiled and raised a weathered hand. "Morning, champ." Grace reached into her worn canvas bag, removed a neatly wrapped sandwich and an apple, and handed them to the man without ceremony. "We'll see you after school," she said gently. There was no performance in her kindness, no audience she expected to impress. It was simply part of who she was. Vincent felt something unfamiliar settle heavily in his chest. His driver asked whether to continue toward the office, but Vincent never answered. His attention had shifted completely to the little boy now skipping happily beside Grace toward the school entrance. Just before disappearing through the front doors, the child stumbled, and Grace caught him instinctively, pulling him close before kissing the top of his head. For one impossible second, the boy lifted his face toward the light, and Vincent's heartbeat slowed. There was something hauntingly familiar about those eyes, about the shape of his smile, about the quiet confidence hidden beneath his innocent expression. It reminded Vincent of someone he had once trusted with his life, someone whose memory had never truly faded. As Grace disappeared inside the school, Vincent found himself giving an order he never imagined he would speak. "Don't go to the office," he said quietly without taking his eyes off the building. "Follow them. I need to know how Grace Carter has been living all these years, and who that little boy really is." Vincent remained inside the parked sedan long after the school doors had closed behind Grace and Elijah. The city moved around him with its usual urgency as commuters hurried toward train stations, delivery trucks crowded the streets, and coffee shops filled with the familiar rhythm of another weekday morning. Yet his thoughts had drifted somewhere 7 years into the past, back to a season he had almost convinced himself no longer mattered. Grace Carter had arrived at the Castellano estate, carrying nothing more than a small suitcase, an impeccable list of references, and a quiet confidence that immediately separated her from every employee who had come before her. She never tried to impress anyone. She never sought favor, special treatment, or praise. Instead, she greeted every member of the household with genuine kindness, remembered birthdays without writing them down, and somehow managed to make even the enormous mansion feel warmer simply by being there. The older staff adored her because she listened more than she spoke. The younger employees admired her because she never competed with anyone. Even guests who barely noticed the household staff often remembered the gracious young woman with the warm smile and gentle voice. Vincent rarely paid attention to the people working behind the scenes of his home, yet Grace became impossible not to notice. Every morning, fresh flowers appeared in the dining room, arranged with remarkable care. Every evening, books left open in the library returned to their shelves exactly where they belonged. His favorite coffee always appeared before his first meeting without anyone needing to ask. She anticipated needs before they became requests, treating every responsibility not as an obligation, but as an opportunity to serve with dignity. One afternoon, Vincent had unexpectedly found Grace sitting beside the estate gardener during her lunch break. The elderly man had recently lost his wife after nearly 50 years of marriage, and while everyone else offered brief condolences before returning to work, Grace quietly shared her meal with him every afternoon for 2 weeks. She never mentioned it to anyone. Vincent only discovered it by chance while walking through the gardens. He remembered hearing the gardener laugh for the first time since his loss, his weathered face softened by the simple comfort of genuine companionship. Grace noticed Vincent standing nearby and immediately rose, apologizing for taking an extra few minutes before returning to her duties. Vincent simply nodded and continued walking, but the image stayed with him longer than he expected. There was something uncommon about a person who chose compassion even when nobody was watching. Then, without warning, everything changed. Grace requested a private meeting with the estate manager on a quiet Friday afternoon. She thanked the household for every opportunity she had been given, submitted a handwritten resignation, and explained only that personal circumstances required her immediate departure. She declined severance pay. She refused letters of recommendation beyond the standard employment record. She packed the same modest suitcase she had arrived with and left before sunset. The staff whispered for weeks, inventing theories that ranged from family emergencies to better job offers in another state, but none of them truly knew. Vincent considered asking questions, yet business obligations quickly pulled his attention elsewhere, and the unanswered mysteries slowly disappeared beneath years of larger responsibilities. Now, staring toward the elementary school where Grace had just disappeared with the little boy, Vincent realized something that unsettled him more than any forgotten memory. In all the years she had worked inside his home, Grace had never once spoken about having family, a husband, or even someone waiting for her beyond the estate gates. Yet today she carried herself with the quiet strength of a mother who had spent years placing another life ahead of her own. And somehow that realization made the silence surrounding her departure feel less like coincidence and more like the beginning of a story he had never taken the time to understand. At the following morning, Vincent instructed his security director to gather information without disturbing Grace's life in any way. By sunset, the first report arrived, and every page weighed heavier than the one before it. Grace Carter worked 3 jobs across Chicago. Her mornings began before sunrise cleaning offices in a medical building on the north side. After taking Elijah to school, she spent the afternoon at a neighborhood bakery packaging fresh bread and greeting customers with the same gentle smile Vincent remembered from years ago. 3 evenings each week, she cleaned classrooms at a community college before returning home well after dark. There were no luxury apartments, no hidden bank accounts, and no mysterious benefactors. She rented a modest 1-bedroom apartment in an aging brick building where every dollar seemed carefully planned before it was spent. Yet the report also revealed something far more remarkable than financial hardship. Grace had never missed one of Elijah's school events. Teachers described her as dependable, encouraging, and always present despite her exhausting schedule. Every Friday afternoon, she volunteered for 1 hour in the school library, helping children choose books before quietly leaving for her second job. The principal wrote a short note that had been added to the report after investigators requested general information. It simply said, "Mrs. Carter teaches kindness better than most people teach mathematics." Vincent read the sentence twice before placing the papers back on his desk. The next afternoon, unable to ignore the questions filling his mind, he drove alone to the neighborhood where Grace lived. He parked across the street just as school ended and watched children pour onto the sidewalk. Elijah ran through the gate carrying a worn backpack and immediately searched the crowd until he spotted his mother waiting beside a city bus stop. His face brightened with complete trust. Grace knelt to his height, listened patiently as he excitedly described his day, then laughed when he proudly showed her a gold star sticker attached to his notebook. Together, they boarded a crowded city bus instead of calling a ride or accepting help from anyone. Vincent quietly followed in another vehicle until they reached a neighborhood grocery store. Grace compared prices with careful attention, selecting fresh vegetables, milk, eggs, and a small package of strawberries after Elijah pointed to them hopefully. Before placing them into the shopping basket, she smiled and reminded him that strawberries were a special treat because they had stayed within their weekly budget. Elijah nodded without disappointment, hugging the carton as though it were treasure. On the walk home, they stopped once more beneath the familiar bus shelter where Mr. Harris sat reading an old paperback novel. Elijah eagerly handed him one of the strawberries before taking one for himself. Grace never corrected him or suggested they save the fruit for later. Instead, she smiled with quiet pride. When we share what we have. Over the next several days, Vincent stopped relying on reports and began trusting his own eyes. He adjusted his schedule without explaining why, leaving meetings early and declining invitations that once would have seemed impossible to refuse. Every afternoon seemed to draw him back to the same neighborhood where Grace and Elijah quietly built a life that required no audience. The more he watched, the more confused he became. He had assumed that years of hardship would eventually force anyone to accept help wherever it appeared. Yet Grace carried herself with the same quiet independence she had possessed inside his estate. One rainy afternoon, a luxury sport utility vehicle pulled alongside her as she waited at a bus stop with Elijah. A professionally dressed woman stepped out carrying an envelope and greeted Grace with obvious concern. Vincent could not hear every word from across the street, but he saw the woman gently extend the envelope toward her. Grace smiled warmly, folded the woman's hand back around it, and shook her head. There was no embarrassment in her expression, only gratitude. After a brief conversation, the two women embraced before parting with genuine affection. Grace boarded the bus with Elijah exactly as she had planned. She never looked back at the envelope that remained in the other woman's hands. Another evening, Vincent watched Grace finish her shift at the bakery. The owner approached her before closing and handed her a neatly packed box filled with pastries that had not sold that day. Grace thanked him sincerely but carefully selected only 2 small rolls before returning the rest. The owner insisted she take everything, explaining that it would otherwise be discarded. Grace smiled and answered softly enough that Vincent could barely make out the words through the open window of his car. Someone else may need them more than we do. The owner eventually divided the box between several shelters before waving goodbye to Grace as though she were family. Vincent found himself staring at the empty sidewalk long after she disappeared around the corner. He had spent years believing generosity belonged to those with the greatest resources. Grace quietly proved that generosity belonged to those with the greatest character. The moment that stayed with him most came on a bright Saturday morning at a neighborhood park. Elijah was playing catch with several children when the ball rolled toward Vincent's bench. The little boy hurried over, picked it up, then noticed an elderly veteran struggling to carry folding chairs toward a community picnic area. Without waiting for anyone to ask, Elijah carried the chairs one by one until every last one had been arranged beneath the shade trees. The veteran thanked him with a smile and offered him $5 from his wallet. Elijah politely shook his head. "My mom says helping people is not something you sell." The veteran looked toward Grace, who simply smiled from across the field while organizing paper plates for the neighborhood lunch. She had heard every word, yet she neither praised her son nor drew attention to what he had done. She simply trusted the values she had planted to speak for themselves. Vincent lowered his eyes, remembering countless business deals built on favors, influence, and expectations. Grace was teaching Elijah an entirely different currency, one measured by integrity instead of reward. As the afternoon sun settled across the park, Vincent noticed Elijah remove a small wooden keepsake box from his backpack before showing it proudly to another child. Grace glanced toward the box with unusual tenderness, almost as though it contained something far more valuable than money. Vincent could not see what rested inside, but the expression on her face told him that whatever she had protected for all these years carried the answer to questions that had only just begun to surface. The answer arrived on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon in the most unexpected way. Vincent had stopped near the neighborhood community center after seeing Grace volunteer to help organize donated school supplies for local families. Children ran through the gymnasium, laughing, while parents folded clothes and stacked boxes along the walls. Elijah sat quietly at a small table in the corner with the same wooden keepsake box Vincent had noticed in the park only days before. Curious, Vincent remained outside the open doorway, careful not to interrupt the warmth unfolding inside. Elijah slowly lifted the lid and showed its contents to another little boy with unmistakable pride. There was no expensive treasure hidden inside. Instead, the box held a carefully folded American flag pin, a silver wristwatch with a cracked leather band, several faded photographs, a handwritten letter tied with a blue ribbon, and a simple wedding ring hanging from a thin chain. "These belong to my dad," Elijah said softly. "Mom says they are worth more than anything because they remind us that good people never really leave us." The other child asked the question every young boy eventually asks. "Where is your dad now?" Elijah smiled with surprising peace for someone so young. "Mom says he is with God, but every time I make the right choice, he is still cheering for me." Vincent felt something tighten inside his chest. There was nothing unusual about a child remembering his father, yet the silver watch resting inside the box seemed strangely familiar. Before he could study it more closely, Grace gently walked over and knelt beside Elijah. She brushed a strand of hair away from his forehead before carefully placing the watch back inside the box with remarkable tenderness. "We only open this when our hands are clean," she reminded him with a gentle smile. "Your father worked hard for everything he earned, and we honor that by taking care of what he left behind." Elijah nodded seriously before locking the small brass latch. A volunteer called Grace to help carry another stack of books, leaving the keepsake box unattended for only a brief moment. A sudden gust of wind swept through the open doorway, knocking several papers from a nearby table onto the floor. Elijah instinctively rushed to help collect them, accidentally leaving the wooden box open beside his chair. Vincent hesitated. Every instinct told him to respect Grace's privacy, yet another part of him could not ignore the growing feeling that fate itself had placed him there. He stepped forward just far enough to close the lid before anything could fall out. As he reached for the box, the folded letter shifted slightly, revealing the corner of an old photograph beneath it. Vincent froze. Only part of the picture was visible, but it showed the sleeve of a dark jacket embroidered with a distinctive family crest that had not been used in years. His own family had commissioned those jackets for a small circle of trusted associates nearly a decade earlier. Even more startling was the silver wristwatch. He recognized the deep scratch crossing its face because he had witnessed the accident that caused it during a charity construction project many years before. There had only been one owner. Vincent slowly withdrew his hand just as Elijah hurried back across the room. The little boy smiled politely, thanked him for protecting the box, and hugged it tightly against his chest before running back to his mother. Vincent remained standing in complete silence. The room bustled with cheerful conversation around him, yet every sound seemed distant. The keepsakes inside that small wooden box did not belong to a stranger. They belonged to someone Vincent had once trusted completely, someone whose disappearance had left questions nobody had ever managed to answer. And for the first time, he realized the truth he had been searching for all week was far closer than he had ever imagined. Vincent returned to his office carrying questions that refused to leave him alone. Long after the city lights appeared beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, he remained seated at his desk with the old family archives spread before him. Most people believed he kept records only for business, but Vincent had always preserved photographs, letters, and personal mementos connected to the people who had earned his respect. After nearly an hour of searching, he found the picture he had not looked at in years. Standing beside him was Daniel Brooks, smiling beneath the afternoon sun while wearing the same embroidered jacket Vincent had glimpsed inside Elijah's photograph. On Daniel's left wrist rested the identical silver watch, marked by the same scratch that had caught Vincent's attention only hours earlier. The realization left him completely still. Daniel had not simply been someone who worked beside him. He had been one of the few people whose honesty had never been questioned. Kind, dependable, and endlessly patient, Daniel possessed the rare ability to calm disagreements before they became lasting divisions. Even the household staff remembered him as the man who always carried extra gloves during winter so no one would have to work outside with cold hands. Vincent slowly opened another storage box containing farewell letters and old employment files. Daniel's folder ended abruptly with a brief note explaining that he had resigned unexpectedly because of urgent personal matters. No further explanation had ever been requested. At the time, Vincent had accepted the decision without looking deeper, believing every employee deserved privacy. Now that choice felt painfully incomplete. The next morning, he quietly contacted Margaret Ellis, the retired estate manager who had supervised the household years earlier. Her warm voice brightened as soon as she recognized him, but when Vincent gently mentioned Grace and Daniel, a long silence settled over the phone. Finally, she spoke with careful honesty. Daniel and Grace cared deeply for each other, but they kept their relationship private because they never wanted their personal lives to affect their work. They were good people, Vincent. Better than most of us realized. Vincent closed his eyes as another missing piece quietly fell into place. Why did they both leave so suddenly, he asked. Margaret sighed softly. Daniel believed he needed to settle something from his past before starting a family. Grace supported him every step of the way. Then one day she came to my office carrying tears she refused to let fall. She told me Daniel had passed away unexpectedly after helping strangers during an emergency on his way home. She never complained. She never blamed anyone. She only asked for enough time to begin a new life because she had just learned she was expecting a baby. Vincent could barely speak. Why was I never told? Margaret answered with the same quiet dignity Grace had always carried. Because Grace asked me not to tell you. She said you had already carried enough responsibility and that Daniel would never have wanted anyone to feel obligated to his family. She wanted her child to grow up knowing gratitude instead of debt. After the call ended, Vincent remained motionless, staring at Daniel's smiling face in the old photograph. Every assumption he had formed over the past 7 years quietly disappeared. Grace had never hidden the truth out of shame. She had protected the memory of the man she loved while honoring his final wishes with remarkable courage. As Vincent gently turned the photograph over, a handwritten sentence on the back caught his attention in Daniel's familiar handwriting. If life ever takes me away too soon, promise me that our child grows up proud instead of pitted. Vincent lowered the picture into his hands, and for the first time since seeing Grace again, he understood that the greatest burden she had carried was not raising Elijah alone. It was keeping a promise that had cost her everything while asking nothing from anyone in return. Edit for the next several days, Vincent found himself returning to one memory he had spent years overlooking. Daniel Brooks had never asked for recognition. While others celebrated promotions or negotiated salaries, Daniel quietly volunteered for the tasks nobody wanted. He stayed late whenever another employee needed to get home to family, fixed broken equipment before anyone noticed, and somehow remembered the names of every security guard, gardener, and kitchen assistant on the estate. Vincent had admired those qualities without ever realizing how extraordinary they truly were. Determined to understand the full story, he visited St. Andrew's Community Church, where Margaret had mentioned Grace still volunteered every Sunday morning. The small brick building stood peacefully between rows of maple trees, its food pantry serving dozens of families each week. Pastor Michael greeted Vincent with polite surprise, but quickly recognized the names that had brought him there. His expression softened immediately. Grace and Daniel were remarkable people, he said quietly as they walked through the fellowship hall. Even before they were engaged, they spent nearly every Saturday here helping families they had never met. They believed kindness should never wait until someone became wealthy. Pastor Michael unlocked a small cabinet and carefully removed an old volunteer scrapbook filled with handwritten notes and photographs from community events. Vincent slowly turned the pages until one picture stopped him completely. Daniel stood beside Grace, both wearing simple blue volunteer shirts while serving meals during a neighborhood appreciation day. Their smiles carried the peaceful confidence of two people building a future together. Tucked beside the photograph was a folded note written in Daniel's familiar handwriting. Vincent unfolded it carefully. If anything ever happens to me, I hope my child learns that character matters more than comfort and that every honest job deserves respect. Promise me our family will never ask for pity when we can still choose dignity. Vincent closed his eyes as the words settled deeply inside him. Pastor Michael spoke again, almost as though reading his thoughts. Daniel, came he. The following Saturday, Grace arrived at the community center before sunrise, expecting another ordinary morning of sorting donated clothing and preparing breakfast for neighborhood families. Elijah happily carried boxes of canned food that seemed almost too heavy for his small arms, refusing to let anyone else finish the job for him. Grace smiled every time she watched her son greet strangers with the same warmth he offered lifelong friends. She had no idea that Vincent was quietly standing near the entrance, dressed far more simply than anyone had ever seen him before. There were no assistants surrounding him, no formal announcement, and no expectation that anyone should notice his arrival. He waited until the morning rush had settled before slowly walking toward Grace. She looked up, immediately recognizing him despite the passing years. Surprise crossed her face, but not fear. "Mr. Castellano," she said softly. "It has been a long time." Vincent nodded, unable to hide the emotion in his voice. Far too long. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The sounds of children laughing nearby filled the silence that words could not immediately bridge. Finally, Vincent reached into his coat pocket and carefully removed Daniel's handwritten letter. Grace recognized the folded paper instantly. Her eyes widened before she gently lowered them again. "Pastor Michael kept his promise," she whispered. Vincent answered with quiet respect. "And you kept yours." Grace looked toward Elijah, who was helping an elderly volunteer arrange chairs exactly as Daniel once had. Pride shined across her face. "Every single day," she replied. Vincent followed her gaze. "He is becoming the man Daniel hoped he would be." Grace smiled, but there was sadness resting beneath her gratitude. "I only tried to give my son the father he deserved, even after he could no longer hear his father's voice." Vincent slowly shook his head. "No, Grace. You gave him something even greater. You gave him his father's values." Grace remained silent. She had never expected anyone to understand the years she had carried alone. Vincent carefully continued. "Daniel believed I owed him nothing. He asked that no one rescue your family out of obligation. I will honor that wish." Grace nodded appreciatively. "Thank you." Vincent then spoke the words he had come to say. But honoring his wish does not mean ignoring his legacy. He handed Grace a simple folder instead of a check or legal document. Inside was a proposal establishing the Daniel Brooks Community Scholarship, a program that would provide educational opportunities for children from hardworking families across Chicago. Daniel's name appeared at the top in bold letters, followed by a single sentence. "Character leaves the greatest inheritance." Grace covered her mouth as tears quietly filled her eyes. Vincent gently explained, "This is not charity. It is recognition. Daniel spent his life lifting other people. Now his name will continue doing the same for generations." Before Grace could answer, Elijah walked over carrying a folded tablecloth. "Mom, do you need help?" he asked with his usual cheerful smile. Vincent knelt until he was at eye level with the little boy. "Your father was a remarkable man," he said sincerely. "And from everything I have seen, you are making him proud every single day." Elijah looked at his mother before smiling shyly. "She tells me that all the time." Vincent glanced at Grace, and in that quiet exchange both of them understood something that required no further explanation. Some debts could never be repaid with money, influence, or power. They could only be honored by protecting the dignity of the people who had quietly carried them for years. And on that peaceful morning, the weight Grace had borne alone for so long finally became a legacy the entire community would remember with gratitude instead of silence. Several months passed, and autumn painted Chicago in shades of gold and amber. The Daniel Brooks Community Scholarship had quietly become one of the city's most respected educational programs, not because it carried the name of a successful organization, but because every application was reviewed with the same principle Daniel had believed in throughout his life. Character came before circumstance. Teachers began sharing stories of children inspired by the scholarship's message, while families who had once struggled alone discovered opportunities they never imagined possible. Grace never accepted a leadership position within the program despite countless invitations. She continued working, continued volunteering, and continued living with the same quiet humility that had defined every chapter of her life. When reporters occasionally asked why she refused public recognition, she always answered with a gentle smile. "The purpose of kindness is not to be noticed. It is to make sure someone else is." Elijah grew taller with each passing season. His backpack became heavier with books, his questions became deeper, and his heart somehow became even more generous. Every Saturday morning, he still visited Mr. Harris beneath the familiar bus shelter. Although the elderly man now lived in a comfortable apartment after neighbors had quietly come together to support him, Elijah insisted on stopping by anyway because, as he often explained, friendship should never disappear just because someone's circumstances improve. Vincent watched these small moments from time to time, never intruding, never trying to become the center of their story. Instead, he learned that the greatest way to honor Daniel was not by replacing him, but by protecting the future Daniel had dreamed about. One crisp October afternoon, the community gathered for the dedication of a small reading garden beside the neighborhood library. Children filled the benches while parents, teachers, and volunteers stood together beneath colorful maple trees. At the entrance rested a simple bronze plaque engraved with Daniel's favorite words: "Character leaves the greatest inheritance." Grace stood quietly near the back of the crowd, hoping to remain unnoticed as always. Vincent stepped to the podium only long enough to share a few heartfelt sentences. "There are people whose names appear in newspapers because of power," he said calmly. "And there are people whose names deserve to be remembered because they quietly changed lives without asking for applause." Daniel Brooks belonged to the second group. Grace Carter carried his dream forward with extraordinary courage. Today we celebrate both of them. The audience rose in a long standing ovation, but Grace lowered her eyes with humble gratitude rather than pride. As the applause slowly faded, Elijah slipped his small hand into Vincent's. Looking up with complete sincerity, he asked the question that no one else could have spoken. "Mr. Vincent, my mom says my dad believed family is about love and respect. Would it be all right if I called you Uncle Vincent?" The entire garden became wonderfully still. Vincent felt his eyes grow warm as he looked toward Grace. She gave the smallest nod, trusting both Daniel's memory and the future standing before her. Vincent smiled through quiet emotion and gently squeezed Elijah's shoulder. "I would be honored," he answered softly. Elijah wrapped his arms around him in an innocent embrace before running back to his mother, who welcomed him with the same peaceful smile that had carried them through every difficult year. As the afternoon sun filtered through the golden leaves, Vincent realized that true influence had never been measured by wealth, reputation, or authority. It was measured by the lives quietly transformed through compassion, integrity, and unwavering dignity. Grace had protected those values when no one was watching. Daniel had planted them long before anyone noticed. Elijah would carry them into the future. And on that beautiful autumn day, everyone present remembered what dignity truly looks like.